What is up, guys? Today we're back at it again with Project
15.
and it is day 26 and we're going to be reading from Genesis 41.
Pharaoh's dreams. Pause right now and watch the video.
G'day teenagers. Well, when we last left off the book of Genesis, we were zeroing in on the life of Joseph, who was the great-grandson of Abraham. And Joseph ended up in Egypt and he ended up in prison for a crime he did not commit. Whilst in prison, Joseph encountered two men who had worked for the Pharaoh, one who was the cupbearer and the other who was the baker. And as the chapter went on, we noticed that both of these individuals had dreams which Joseph successfully interpreted. The cupbearer was restored to his position, whereas the baker was executed because of the conspiracy he had plotted against the Pharaoh. Now in chapter 41, Joseph has been in prison for a further 2 years after those original dreams. And this is what the text says. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing on the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up. But he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up and realized it was a dream. The next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dream, so he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dream, not one of them could tell him what they meant. So if you remember in the last episode, I mentioned that people in the ancient world treated dreams very, very seriously. They believed that God, or if you're a polytheist, the gods could communicate to you through dreams. They would give you dreams but not reveal to you the meaning. And ancient people, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, they would prioritize the interpretation of dreams, and they would even have dream books which would try to reveal the meaning and the symbolism of different features or aspects of the dream. And that's what Pharaoh does. He consults the wise men or the learned people in the meaning of his dream. What does it mean? What do all these things mean? And as the chapter unfolds, we notice that none of these wise men are able to give Pharaoh the meaning or the interpretation of the dream. Then we have the chief cupbearer who realizes and remembers Joseph. So they summon Joseph out of the dungeons, and it says that he shaves. Egyptian priests, and you'll probably know from Egyptian iconography or when you've seen movies about ancient Egypt, Egyptian priests or even the Pharaoh would often shave their heads and their bodies. It was a symbol of their priesthood. So Joseph is shaved and he's brought before Pharaoh. Now, you can understand a little bit why some of these wise men would have been unable or unwilling to interpret the dreams. God had not revealed to them the meaning of these dreams. They worshipped false gods who didn't exist. But also, in the ancient world, if you misinterpreted dreams, you could be executed. So they are afraid of what Pharaoh might do. But we notice that Joseph interprets the meaning of the dreams. Now remember, Pharaoh has had 2 dreams. In one dream, he's standing on the bank of the Nile. Now the Nile was an extremely important part of ancient Egypt. Every year when the Nile would flood, the water would be irrigated and it would water the land and make the region of Egypt very, very fertile. And this is how people grew crops. So the Nile was extremely important to the economic prosperity and the vitality of ancient Egypt. Without the Nile flooding every single year, people would starve and there would be famine. And the Egyptians even worshipped the Nile. They had the god of the Nile, Hapi, who they worshipped. So this dream greatly troubled Pharaoh. And you'll notice that out of the water came 7 cows who were healthy and fat. And then you have 7 cows who are not healthy. They're skinny and thin and malnourished. Again, the cow was an important symbol in ancient Egyptian mythology and in ancient Egyptian religious systems. The cow was personified almost as a deity in ancient Egypt. You had what was called the Apis bull, and they believed that it was a sacred animal at times. So this vision, no doubt, bothers Pharaoh, and he's trying to figure out what's going on and what's happening. Again, in the second dream, he had a dream basically of a field. And as he's in the field, he sees a stalk of grain. So you know, grains have stalk, and then there are heads of grain and wheat which come up out of that. And he sees a stalk which has 7 heads. And these 7 heads of grain are good for eating. They're well nourished and they're good. But then the next 7 which come up are not, and they devour those 7 that are. And he wonders, what is the meaning of this dream? Again, ancient Egypt was regarded as the breadbasket of the ancient world. People would come to them because the Nile flooded and because the region was fertile. People would come to them for grain, and they supplied much of the ancient world throughout ancient history. So Joseph comes forward and he interprets successfully the meaning of these dreams for Pharaoh. And he says and he reveals that these dreams signify that Egypt will have 7 years of prosperity, but then 7 years of famine. And famine in the ancient world was crippling. There was no processed food. If you had 7 years of famine, it would wipe out huge sections of the population, and the death toll would be massive. And Joseph reveals that they're going to have 7 prosperous years, but 7 bad years of famine. And Joseph's suggestion, his advice basically is that you need to take advantage of these 7 years of economic prosperity and set aside enough grain so that when the 7 years of famine come, you'll be able to manage the food supply for the population of Egypt. And that's exactly what happens. Joseph is promoted. He basically becomes the second in charge in ancient Egypt under the authority of Pharaoh only. The technical phrase is vizier, the royal vizier. Joseph becomes the royal vizier, the equivalent of a prime minister or a vice president. That is how senior he becomes. And as the story goes, it talks about how Joseph successfully manages Egypt's grain supply throughout these years. He takes grain from the surplus they have during the prosperous years and he sets it aside for the years of drought. Now, as the story goes on, Joseph will exercise the duty of being the royal vizier excellently. He will successfully manage the grain supply of ancient Egypt throughout this tumultuous period. And Joseph is given a wife. It is a lady who is the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Her name is Asenath. And as you read this chapter, you'll notice that Joseph and Asenath have 2 children, one whose name is Manasseh and the other whose name is Ephraim. Now, the reason why this is important is if we recall our examination all the way back to when we looked at the life of Abraham, remember, what had God promised Abraham? He had promised him that he was going to give him descendants, and from his descendants, a great nation who would be God's people would be formed. So we can see in Joseph having children, he is now continuing to be fruitful and multiply just as God had promised Abraham. And Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, will join together with 10 of Jacob's sons to become the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. Now, how teenagers might we apply a passage like Genesis 41? Well, I want you just to think about this important thing. Obviously, the faithfulness of God is shown right the way through the book of Genesis as he continues to fulfill his promises to Abraham. But I want you to think about the life of Joseph. Joseph had hostility with his brothers. He was sold off into slavery and he ended up in prison for a crime he did not commit. Yet by the end of Genesis 41, God has restored his life and he's taken him to the point where now he is the royal vizier. He's second in charge in all of ancient Egypt during this time period. Now, isn't that amazing, the power of God to take Joseph from prison and to esteem him and to elevate him to this high position? But the reason why God elevated Joseph was not so that Joseph could just get rich and get a better life. Now, the reason why God elevated him was so that Joseph could declare his glory to the world. As God had been good to Joseph and taught Joseph and educated him and given him purpose, Joseph was going to be a blessing to the world, to the ancient Egyptians, and then eventually to his own brothers when there would be a restoration. And I want you to know, teenagers, that God can pick you up. No matter how far your life falls, God can pick you up and He can restore you to a place where you will declare His praises to the world, just like Joseph did. You will share His glory to the world and tell people about Jesus. So never give up, even when life is tough, even when life is hard, because God has a plan and purpose for your life. Imagine being Joseph in the prison, thinking that his life was over, he was going to die in prison. Yet God had different plans for him. God was going to make him and use him to build His people group, just like God uses you and I today to build a people group who belong to Him and who worship the Lord Jesus. Well, God bless you, brothers and sisters, and we'll see you next episode.